Capitol Report is a production of Senate Media Services.
This week, the governor and leaders weigh in on the latest budget projections showing an improved outlook on Minnesota's economy. MMB Commissioner Jim Schowalter and State Economist Kalambokidis join me to dig into the implications. Stay tuned for this week's Capitol Report. Welcome to this week's program. I'm Shannon Loehrke. This week, state budget leaders released the November budget and economic forecast, which sets a baseline for budget planning in the coming legislative session. The latest numbers show a projected surplus of $641 million for the biennium that ends in June, and a projected deficit of about $1.3 billion for the next biennium. Following the announcement, Governor Walz and legislative leaders responded to the latest economic news.
Minnesota has managed our state budget well. We've made smart decisions preparing for an economic downturn and ensuring that our tax policy is able to withstand the unexpected. Our rainy day fund is still at the highest level in our state's history. And if our forecast holds, we'll still be able to use it as a buffer for projected shortfall in the next biennium or to provide more services to Minnesotans affected by both health and economic crises caused by COVID-19. We are all understanding the impact of COVID-19 better every day, every month, that this is not something that the economy has experienced for a long, long time, in none of our lifetimes. As a result, the best thing we can do is continue to monitor, to learn, and try to ask questions about what's happening and how we can react better.
Someone told me this morning that they had forgotten that you can get good news in 2020. I'm cautiously optimistic about this. I think we should take that for what it is. I'd also like to make note that the reason that this is good, because of the resiliency of Minnesotans. This is the resiliency of Minnesotans in an unprecedented public health crisis to figure out how to work in a different way, to figure out how to get their kids childcare, to care about their neighbors enough to invest and spend back in their local community, to make sure that those businesses, no matter how tenuous the situation were, knew that they were getting support from their neighbors, and to those businesses who were asked to do things, again, that at least in 100 years, no one has been asked.
It is also up to us to make sure we don't leave anyone behind as we continue our fights against COVID-19 and to rebuild our economy. We know, as today's numbers remind us yet again, that the economic effects of the pandemic are not being felt equally, that lower wage workers, those who can afford it least, are bearing it the most. As we face the challenging in ensuring stability in revenue and spending in the upcoming budget cycle, we must keep our options open, and we must be laser focused that we don't add to the burden of working Minnesotans, our frontline workers.
We can see this wild swing from the May and July numbers to what we're hearing in November. We don't know what we'll see in February. I would like to think that the vaccines will work and that we will be good at distributing them, and we'll be, by the time May rolls around, we'll have substantial distribution. I'm hopeful, but what if that doesn't work out, right? So we have to have a budget that is structurally balanced, that's looking to the future, that can anticipate some more bumps in the road. And I think it's really important to realize that when we look out into the future, providing services to human beings is just as important as the numbers in the bank.
In an economic recovery like this, I think we all know the disastrous effect that it would have if we raise taxes. Raising taxes on job creators who are struggling, raising taxes on Minnesota families who are struggling. No one would say to you that that is the right solution to get out of this with a straight face. And if we don't want to make cuts, the answer is let's grow our way out of this. And there's a lot of other things that we can do to cut red tape and make it easier to conduct business in Minnesota, make it easier to grow our economy and grow our way out of this. Obviously, our fiscal situation changed pretty drastically from June or July when that interim forecast came out to today. Let's do the things necessary to make Minnesota the most business-friendly place so that we can actually grow our way out of this.
image on the cover of the November budget and economic forecast document is the Split Rock Lighthouse, shining in the sun while an enormous wave crashes on the shore below. Jim Schowalter, the Commissioner of Minnesota Management and Budget, joined me this week, and I began by asking him if this image is a hopeful metaphor that Minnesota's economy will remain steadfast despite the pandemic's thrashing.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really a delight to talk with you, and I love the imagery and what you're pulling out of what I just think is a beautiful picture of Minnesota. You know, we just appreciate that there's tough times. There are always challenges out there, but Minnesota's come through them. And, you know, I think this lighthouse, you can read into it all kinds of things. Bottom line is, it's a good place. We've been here before, and I think there's a light out there for the future.
This forecast was certainly brighter than what had been projected in May. What had been an over $2 billion shortfall for the current biennium is now just $641 million surplus. The projected deficit for the next biennium also dropped considerably and is now less than the budget reserve. Why such starkly different numbers in less than 6 months?
We have been going through an unprecedented, unpredictable year. I don't think any of us could have anticipated that 2020 would look and feel like it has. And that's true for economists. It's true for state tax collections or budget people looking at state spending. You know, when the state took a look in April and May at what was going to still be happening in the rest of this biennium, it was in the midst of a free fall of the economy. And our reaction to that was uncertain. What we have found out in the 6 months is that people are continuing to spend money, that our sales tax revenues didn't go down, they actually went up. And that, you know, typically in a recession, we spend more money. In fact, we spent less, simply because of the nature of this pandemic and the really unique impact it's had on all of us Minnesotans.
How ideally should that $2+ billion budget reserve fund be used? Does it make sense to use some of that money to plug some of the potential deficit in the next biennium in whole or in part? What's your view on the best use of that rainy day fund?
Well, I think I have some opinions and I'll share them, but I think the first thing I just want to communicate is, thank goodness we have it. When I was commissioner in the Dayton administration, I had the opportunity to serve during a different time. And unfortunately, it was also a challenging time with the Great Recession. And we didn't have a reserve of any significance. We had a cash flow account. That was about it. And that meant that we had to make decisions in real time. That meant that we had to make adjustments without understanding the potential impact. And we had to make more big, immediate changes. I think Minnesota is just so lucky that over the last number of years, we've grown the reserve, that legislators and governors and MMB commissioners, we've all pulled together in the same direction to give people time so that we all have some time and ability to adjust, whether that means we're going to spend some of it for immediate relief for COVID-19 and pandemic and small business relief, or whether it means that we're going to save a little bit of it and use it to help even out the deficit in the next biennium, or hopefully keep some of it so we continue to have choices. Because the bottom line is what it does is gives Minnesota a unique ability to not make rash decisions and help its people as effectively as possible and learn so that we do the right things. A lot of other states just aren't in that position right now, and I think we're all happy and lucky for it.
Well, speaking of uniqueness, you have a unique perspective because you were commissioner following the Great Recession, as you just said, and now you are commissioner as we are in the midst of a global pandemic. Can you just compare and contrast those experiences a little bit? What's the same? What's different?
Yeah, it is. There are some similarities. Certainly, there's just a stress level in state government, in the legislature, in the public at large, because we're all uncertain, unclear about, how our personal circumstances are going to be, how our organizations are going to fare in the future, how our society is going to react to all the challenges and unknowns. But I think what's really unique, and I've never seen anything like it before, is that state government is really acting on a day-to-day basis, trying to figure out how to react and help people in the pandemic, to manage the unprecedented number of illnesses, deaths, structural challenges that happen on a day-to-day basis where you don't know what's going to happen if a homeless shelter is going to have a sudden outbreak, if a long-term care facility with vulnerable adults doesn't have staff to help its people that day. You know, there are crazy, difficult challenges every day, and we're managing that, even as we're trying to assess what our financial trade-offs are and look long-term. That's a very different and extremely challenging situation for Minnesota state government, and I think state governments and governments across the world.
In this week's press conference, you emphasized that this forecast does not take into account an anticipated $4.2 billion inflationary impact. Why was it important to you to make this point?
You know, when we release a forecast, it is human nature to fixate on a number. Like, what is the number? It's easier for us to remember. It's easier for me to remember. But it also then tends to limit our understanding of what's coming up. And, you know, honestly, with so many uncertainties still ahead, you know, whether the Supreme Court will modify the Affordable Care Act, whether Congress will pass some state release and economic stimulus, whether the path of the pandemic will change materially from what we currently experience, or whether vaccines will be available in large enough numbers so that this spring and summer we can get back to something closer to normal. You know, these are huge questions. So I really think it's important for us to understand we're going to continually making choices, that we still have challenges ahead, and that while the challenge of the budget numbers are considerably more favorable than they were before, there's still choices, there's still challenges, and we're going to keep on having to make decisions on an ongoing basis, not just wait around till January, not just wait around till May or June, but we're still going to be managing actively those questions and adjusting along the way.
And that was a lot of what you had to say. I mean, there was, I believe, a collective sigh of relief with these numbers, but you've also gone on to say that it's a volatile time with difficult decisions ahead. That said, the February forecast will reveal even more, and you will work with the governor in shaping his budget priorities at that time. But what, at this point, do you think Minnesotans should be prepared for? Will there be a need for some belt tightening or perhaps revenue raising or both? What are you saying to people right now?
Well, you know, Shannon, that's a great question. And we're really right now trying to almost adjust to a changed reality, because up until a couple of days ago, we were all working under the assumption that, frankly, everything had to be on the table, that we had to have significant changes in both our revenues, in our spending, in our financial outlook, just to make it. And now we have some opportunity for choices. And I think that's, you know, why the legislature is looking right now at a special session, because we have choices about how much we want to do, can do right now to help, and whether that makes long-term sense. So, you know, we will undoubtedly have some changes on every front, because the state budget is just too big to just do one thing. You know, there's too many questions. There's too many special questions about how we're going to approach this policy area, this financial challenge. So we'll be looking at all of those tools, but the bottom line is we have choices, and I think we are grateful for that, and hopefully bring a little bit of good news to everyone in Minnesota, where sometimes it's been hard to figure out when will the bad news stop? Well, fortunately, in early December, at least a bit of that bad news did stop.
Commissioner Jim Schowalter, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
In May, budget projections showed a $2.4 billion shortfall for the current budget cycle. This week, that outlook improved to reflect a $640 million surplus. I spoke with State Economist Dr. Kalambokidis about November's economic forecast, and I began by asking her what factors contributed to the financial reversal.
I'm really happy to be here again to talk about the budget outlook. There were improvements in this budget outlook compared to our May projection on both sides of the ledger, so both the revenue side and the spending side. So on the revenue side, we had an improved economic outlook. So remember, we produced our May projection just as the pandemic was taking hold, and the US economy was forecast to contract significantly. It's still forecast to contract, but the US forecasters are expecting a smaller decline in GDP now for this year than what they had forecast in the spring. So we have an improved economic forecast relative to May, and through the course of the summer and fall, Minnesota has collected more tax revenues than what we projected in May. And so those two factors, an improved economic forecast and already higher tax receipts than what we had expected, those things have improved our revenue forecast. So if you jump back to February to look at our February forecast, we have reduced the revenue forecast relative to February. But in the meantime, we did that May projection, and now we're raising the revenue forecast relative to May.
Well, and that May forecast was just, there were so many unknown factors, and certainly we have much more information now. One of the charts in the recent press conference about the budget forecast that I found most interesting was the one that showed the degree to which consumer spending on goods has increased. And you talked about that with the tax receipts. It's well beyond what was forecast. To what do you attribute all of this extra spending?
Yeah, that was really an unexpected development, and it did affect our tax forecast. A couple of things. First, consumer spending generally has been higher this year than what was forecast in the spring. And that's one of the reasons the economic forecast the U.S. economic forecast is higher, because consumer spending has been higher. And that's likely because incomes were supported by federal payments. And then another thing that happened is that consumers figured out new ways to spend money or to purchase things, and they shifted away from spending on services that were restricted because of social distancing and toward goods. Lots of kinds of goods, but durable goods, including furniture, electronics, athletic equipment. And those things are, importantly, those things are taxable in Minnesota. So people were shifting away from some things that are not taxable in Minnesota, like personal services, and toward things that are taxable. And that helped raise our sales tax revenue forecast.
Well, and I also saw that there was an increase in those sin taxes in alcohol and cigarettes and other things. And did that also contribute then?
Yes, that as well. So gambling receipts, alcohol and tobacco tax receipts were also higher than expected.
The budget report states that Minnesota has 184,000 fewer jobs than in February, and that unemployment has disproportionately affected lower wage workers. How do those job losses among the lower wage workers in particular impact the state's fiscal picture?
Yeah, we know now that a disproportionate share of the unemployment insurance benefit claimants in Minnesota have been from lower wage occupations. So we've had this uneven effect of the economic downturn across industries, across occupations, and across wage levels. We also know from US data that the lower income workers who have been laid off have a longer duration of unemployment than higher wage workers. So what that means is that for a given level of unemployment, the loss of total wage income has been lower. And so we've lost less wage income in the economy and consequently lost less income tax revenue and less sales tax revenue than we would have seen if that unemployment had been more evenly distributed across occupations and wage levels. And beyond the fiscal situation, what it means is that this pandemic and this uneven economic downturn is likely to exacerbate disparities that Minnesota had before this even started.
And so what possibly, I know this isn't your area of expertise, but what is the remedy then for those low-wage workers? Because presumably they would possibly rely on more state services in the future until those jobs can be recovered or retraining for different areas of work?
I think it means that just generally when policymakers are thinking about what do we do next in terms of helping the economy grow and helping people survive this economic downturn, is to bear in mind that unevenness, that this is not affecting, it's affecting every Minnesotan and it's affecting every Minnesota business, but it's not affecting everyone equally. And so targeting support, targeting services, targeting payments toward the people who are most affected is going to help the economy grow faster.
And speaking of that, the forecast assumes that there will not be any more stimulus from the federal government. But if Congress were to pass stimulus to help these people that we're talking about right now, what impact could that have on the projected deficit in the 2022-23 biennium that is, I think, about $1.2 billion?
Yeah. The U.S. forecasters, as you said, did not include more fiscal stimulus in the forecast that we used. But they said that if fiscal stimulus was enacted, whether it's by the end of this year or in early next year, that would improve economic growth in next year, calendar year 21. And so if economic growth is higher in the U.S. next year, it's likely to be higher in Minnesota next year. We're tied to that economy. That would improve tax receipts for fiscal year 22, because if you think about it, people pay income taxes on their 21 income in early 22, in the spring of 22. So that fiscal stimulus would likely improve, all other things held equal. There are lots of other things that can happen, but all other things held equal, that would improve the budget outlook for 22 and 23.
The documents that were released, I know more documents will come out tomorrow, but the ones that were released did not take into account international trade, agriculture, business investment data, which is usually part of the forecast. How are those areas affected by the pandemic and the recovery?
Yeah, we certainly did take all of those things into consideration in constructing our economic and revenue forecast. We just haven't yet released the full report, as you said. So there were risks in each of those areas. In trade, we still have tariffs on trade and trade uncertainty. In agriculture, we have had farm income uncertainty. In business investment has been a challenge at the later end of the economic expansion that just ended. So all of those risks remain underlying the economy. It's just that when the pandemic hit, that overwhelmed all the other risks, and it's the only thing that that the economic press focused on, or not the only thing, but it's the main thing. So it did overwhelm everything else. But once the pandemic is over, those risks are going to bubble back up to the surface, and we'll be talking about them more.
Dr. Laura Kalambokidis, it's always a pleasure. Thank you.
My pleasure. I'm glad to be here.
We close this week's program with a feature from our series, The People's House. The second floor of the state capitol is really the focal point of all of the activity that happens here. What was Cass Gilbert's idea behind this particular design?
The second floor is really called the grand floor of the Capitol because it's where everyone can come up here, get access to the chambers, the House, the Senate, and the Supreme Court. And it's a place where all that activity is taking place each day of session. So you have people lobbying for interest groups here, you have the public that are here to talk to their legislators and so forth, or go to the Supreme Court for their hearings. So really the envision that Cass Gilbert had for this space in the second floor was to be a grand space where you really get a sense of the architecture, these beautiful colonnades of Italian marble column and Minnesota stone. And you also get a place where people feel friendly or welcoming into those spaces, as at the same time they're visiting or coming here for business.
In the other capitals I've visited, I've noticed that the House chamber is often across from the Senate chamber, but not here in our capital. What is the reason for that?
Well, I think what Cass Gilbert was looking at doing is creating a symmetrical building. And so we have, in 1905, there were 63 senators, not the 67 we have today, but we had 119 House members. So that's almost twice the size. So I think for him, how you construct a building with one end of the building with a smaller chamber and the other opposite end with a huge chamber just doesn't fit architecturally. So he put the Senate chamber on the west side of the building, the Supreme Court, a smaller chamber of course, on the opposite end, and then the House, because of its size, fit perfectly in the north corridor or the north side of the buildings.
It may just be a matter of folklore, but I've read that the placement of the House chamber looking at the city of St. Paul is important in terms of representing the people, that the speaker is looking at the people. Is that true?
Yeah, and that's a lot of people look at the way the spaces have been designed or laid out, that Gilbert was looking at the House being kind of the approachable. It's more of the people's house. The members serve a 2-year term, so there's more rotation or more changeover as members leave or get reelected or not reelected.
And there are more of them.
And there's more of them as well. And so the idea is, it kind of symbolically, it faces the public, faces downtown St. Paul.
In 1905, when the Capitol opened, all of the state's constitutional offices were housed in this building, and that's not true today. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. The whole idea of the building here was this is the seat of state government. So you have your executive branch officers, you have the governor, lieutenant governor, the state treasurer, the state auditor, the secretary of state, the Attorney General, all housed within this one building in 1905. And that gives you a sense of how this building has changed over its 112-year history, as you have a lot of those constitutional officers moving out to different chambers. They're going into the state office building back in the 60s and the 70s. You had the administration building where the treasurer moved into. Now the treasurer, we, as a constitutional amendment, abolished the treasurer's office, so there no longer is a treasurer. And that also fits in with the history of the Supreme Court too. They were, until the 1990s, everything they had here, the offices, the law library, the chamber, was their headquarters, kind of their center gathering place for all the work and all the business they do. And then when the Judicial Center was open, they moved there, and so they have new Supreme Court and Appellate Court offices and also chambers there. But they still use this space in the state capitol as an important part of their connection to this building.
Join us again next week as we delve into more topics affecting Minnesotans. I'm Shannon Loehrke, and on behalf of all of us at Senate Media Services, thanks for watching.